If you live in the real world, you want to hear what Dr. Bruce Rubenstein has to say.
If you live in the spiritual world, you will want to hear what Rabbi Shea Hecht has to say.
We may agree,
And we may disagree.
but you want to hear both views.
So let's get right to it.
Welcome to another episode of The Rabbi and the Therapist. So, Dr. Bruce, my question to you is, you went to school, as all of us. You're born, you're into this world, they put you into school. They teach you how to communicate. They teach you how to speak. You bring in your favorite toy in kindergarten, and you get up, show and tell. You talk about your favorite doll and your favorite truck for the class.
I didn't have a favorite doll, Rabbi.
Okay. Good. They then teach you how to read. And then they teach you how to, so I said about how to speak, how to read, and what's the other one? How to read, how to write. Yes, how to write. I guess I'm not that good at how to write. The one important part of a communication that we're not taught about in school is how to listen. And often we make that mistake to think that listening is with our ears. Listening is not with our ears. Listening has to be all-encompassing. We listen with our eyes. We listen with our body. We listen. I often tell people, I walked into my father's room one day, and he's on the telephone. And I'm not sure about this, but we tell the story in this way. He was talking to some old lady, and he's listening. Go, oh, yeah. He was active listening, He was with the person on the other side of that telephone wire was able to say, wow, I am being listened to. And I say it, educators, parents, friends, lovers, husbands and wives, how important is it for us to listen and active listening?
You're 100% right. That it is, you talk about it not being taught. It is a very interesting and at higher levels artful balance. Because think about it this way. On the one hand, you have to be separate from the person to hear them, right? If you're joined with the person,
yes,
right, you can't hear them because you're one. You have to be separate, but at the same time, you have to negate so much of your own thoughts and your own feelings in order to really, as you point out, understand or take in another person's experience, which you're calling listening. It's truly an art. Some people are born with it more naturally than others, but it certainly is something that can be taught, and you cannot minimize the impact it has on an individual when they know they are actually being listened to and heard.
And which brings it really to another subject. As a rabbi, often some people come in and talk to me, I'll say, let me say it back to you to make sure that I understood you. Sometimes they think I'm making fun, they don't realize, no, I just want to make sure that I heard you correctly before I give you some advice. Before we move further, I want to make sure that you are heard properly. Do you think it's an idea to repeat what somebody tells you? Or
no, it's a critical component of listening, but for several reasons. Number one, you're affirming in a way that we're not used to having conversation. You and I, we're sitting here talking, all right? You say something. The first thing out of my mouth is not to reiterate and repeat what you said just so that you know that I was listening to you, right? So we're not used to doing that. But it's very powerful when you do it, because it's an opportunity for an individual to have incredibly powerful proof that someone really heard everything that they said. Point number two, sometimes we don't realize what we're saying. And when someone repeats it back to us, we hear ourselves and we hear our thoughts and we hear our speech in a way that we didn't realize before. So in many ways, it can be infinitely helpful to have that repeated back. It's obviously not practical on an ongoing basis. You wouldn't be able to have a fluid conversation. But in the context of psychotherapy or even a discussion with your rabbi, having what you're saying being repeated back to you could be of infinite meaning.
How often do you in your practice find that people said, I don't feel heard, particularly in a specific relationship, loving relationship? Do you find that people say, hey, I'm not being heard. What can you do? What can you tell my partner? What can you tell my spouse? What
Are you
can you
speaking
tell
now specifically about like couples therapy?
couple therapy, or sometimes, often, let's talk in education. Children who will go into a classroom and say, my teacher didn't hear me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I often acted out in school, but often we have kids who act out in school because they don't feel that they're being heard. Therefore, they're going to do something that's going to make sure that that teacher gets the attention, or they get their teacher's attention.
Yeah, well, at least in the field of child and adolescent psychotherapy, we work very closely with the school, we work very closely with the parents, and obviously with the child, and we delve into those things to get insights not only into what the child is saying or not saying, but also to see what the observed behaviors are and the utterances are at home and at school. Somewhat of a different issue, pardon me, somewhat of a different issue with couples, married couples. Communication there is not, they tell the joke actually, to give you an insider joke in the field. The joke is, you walk into a restaurant, and how do you know, of all the couples that are sitting there having dinner, how do you know which is the couple that's married?
The ones who are sitting quiet. Is that it?
How did you know the answer to that?
Well,
no one ever guesses that.
Yeah,
we have a different
really,
answer, not the ones
yeah.
that quiet, the ones that aren't talking to each other.
Right.
Then the next question is, why aren't they talking to each other? Because they've already said everything they know the other one wants to hear. Because
Yeah, go ahead.
Because their spouses are not listening to each other. They're just hearing each other. That's why I specifically said they're not talking to each other, because they already know everything their spouse wants and doesn't want to hear, but not to listen to.
Yeah. Often when I work with a couple, I will say, go home and share your views. And when you share your view, just play back to the person. We don't want comments. We don't want commentary. What we want is just play back to your spouse what you heard them say. Or another way of communication would say, write out your idea and then exchange papers with your spouse. And then read back, tell your spouse, tell your husband, tell your wife what you read. Oh, so this is what you're saying? No comments. We're not interested in commentary. We're interested in simply making sure that you heard what the person had to say. And I think when you really touched upon it before, listening or hearing that person is so very important, particularly when you're talking about, I think, suicide notes. If we talk about, yes, it's the extreme. I know you're making that face at me, but in suicide notes, most of the times that kid said basically, I felt that I was not heard. I was not heard by my parents, not heard by my school, or I want to make a statement. I want to say something, because if not, I mean, even some of the crazies that we read about, unfortunate things that happen in some of these schools where students came back, they basically wanted to be heard. I want my manifesto that I wrote up, hundreds of pages of what I'm doing. I want it to be heard. And that desire to be heard, the need to be heard is very, very important. And here's the beauty of it. It doesn't cost any money. All you got to do is give a little bit time and a little bit, not so much sympathy, but a little bit of empathy to make sure that your child or your spouse,
loved one,
or your partner, your loved one, feels heard. And I think that is, if there's one thing that what I can do to change the educational system, yes, teach reading, teach writing, teach speaking, but also teach listening. Make sure that Maybe they can have, today we have technology, right? So we can have a tape play and then write down what you heard that person say. Because often, and beauty is it, by the way, you're going to listen to it sometimes different than I do. If someone came in here and gave a speech, you'll walk away with a different Musar Haskell, a lesson. Your lesson may be very different than my lesson.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the beauty generally of crowds and communities. We all walk away with our own lesson.
If there are people who aspire to be better listeners, I think that 2 points can be made. You mentioned that two people can do an exercise where rather than responding, an individual can repeat back to the other person what they said. And then the person obviously feels that they were listened to. There's a tremendous benefit, though, to the person who repeated back what they said. What was that benefit? That they were not reactive, that they stopped reacting. You can't have a reaction and listen wholeheartedly at the same time. Point number 2, it's somewhat erroneous, a bit of a misnomer to say that these things here are our sensory organs, right? When we see something with our eyes, of course we're perceiving something that we're seeing, but when we're looking at something, we're also paying attention to it, which means that it has some level of importance, otherwise we wouldn't be looking at it. Same thing goes with listening. How much noise do you filter out as you're walking down the street because you're not paying attention to it because it's not a priority for you?
So the concept of listening with our eyes is a very true comment. But also one of the things that they're doing and taking different courses on listening, one of the things that you usually say is, and particularly in a format like we have, where we are discussing and sometimes debating an issue, the question is, okay, Dr. Bruce, are you listening to me or you're thinking of what response to give? Of course, I talk to myself. When you say something, am I hearing the words you say? Am I getting the full impact? Am I understanding the importance of the point that you're making? Or am I just thinking, hey, I can come back with a nice comeback. I can ask the next question. I can give another answer.
In which case, you're essentially just waiting for the person to stop talking because you know what you're going to say to them after they finish, right? Is that right?
Well, I'm not sure I always know, but we think we know.
You, Gen 1, generally, right.
Okay. So if there was a format or a message that you can tell parents in particular or anybody out there as far as listening, what would that be?
I think it would be to appreciate the fact that the effort that's required to focus one's attention and to do deep listening, where you negate, as I said before, you self-negate a huge part of yourself and you not be reactive, is one of the highest forms of expressing love towards another individual. And I think that should be enough to motivate people to decrease their reactivity and stop thinking about how they want to answer it. If you watch someone who does this at a very, very high level, the reaction you'll have to this person who is a very, very superb listener is that they're very sincere. That is the reaction. That is the perception when you watch someone who's really superb, who's really mastered the art of listening. That's a sincere person.
As you were talking, I think
were you listening?
I think really said it all. Because, as a Lubavitcher Chassid, I often have read, they have what's called My Story, and people who have, and they said, when I went into the Rebbe's office and I spoke to the Rebbe, I felt that his entire attention, he was listening to me. And it's interesting when you talk about praising people, what they talk about is, I felt that that person listened to me. Often, mix and mingle in the area of politics. And usually politicians, they're shaking your hand, they're looking here, they never look you in the eye. And I say to them, I'm going to go vote for this guy. He has no interest in me. Of course, he's just shaking hands. He's interested in himself getting his votes. But when you talk about particularly a Rabbi, a leader, a personality, I think what you will find that when people praise, when I was with him, when I was with her, I felt the whole world was somewhat out of focus. And they only focused on me because I was able to speak to them. And listening was a very, very important part. So, yeah, I think, number one, to be better listeners are very, very important. But you mentioned also a second point, which I thought was very good and very, very important. You know, love in Hebrew is ahava. One of the words for love is ahava. Ahava comes from the word have, to give. And it's important for us to give. And yet, more important than to give with grace is to receive with grace. And when we listen, we are then receiving from that person.
Lovely.
And when we receive from that person, to a certain extent, it's the highest level of giving when I receive with grace. And this is something very, very powerful. When you listen to your child, you are giving that child something. When you listen to your loved one, when you listen to your spouse, when you listen to your teacher, why is a student so very, very precious to a teacher? Because by listening to your teacher, you're actually, at the same time, giving to that teacher the greatest fulfillment that they can do, that they're being listened to by able to teach to their students. So, our takeaway.
When someone knows that they're being heard or listened to, that's a very, very precious moment. By the way, that's a lovely interpretation that you just gave, even incorporating the etymology of the root of ahava. I'm assuming you said hav. I'm assuming the aleph refers to
Can.
It can. Okay. But that when someone knows that someone is deeply listening to them, it opens up new ideas for them. It opens up new ways of thinking. It gives them an opportunity to get out of this pattern or this gerbil wheel that they're on, which may even be emotional. Right? It may be a prolonged period of just emotional distress, and then all of a sudden they realize that someone is truly listening to them. In keeping with the point, the lovely interpretation you just gave, maybe more of a drasha, but it really gives the person an opportunity to escape the confines, either of their mind or of their heart, and find a direction with some more light.
And when you know people are listening, you're going to be a lot more careful what you say. You're going to say, hey, people are listening. I have to be careful. I carry responsibility in my speech. So that feeds on that as well. Which again, as we started off saying that this format, when we now know that people are listening to us and getting their friends to listen to us, and with FlowMotion behind us and getting out the word, we know that we carry responsibilities, and we hope that you're listening in general, and we hope that you will improve in your listening in the relationships and your loving relationships as well.
Amen. Good. Well, if anyone has any questions, they're welcome to contact us at the email address in the description below.